Welcome to the Eat, Train, Prosper podcast, where we provide you sustainable training principles for strength and building muscle, effective nutrition practices for improving and maintaining a lean physique, and practical lifestyle habits for becoming a champion of your own health, both inside and out. Hosted by Aaron Straker and Brian Borstein. On today's episode of Eat, Train, Prosper, Brian and I are talking about a little bit going into depth on three topics. The first being dieting on a higher carbohydrate diet versus a higher fat intake diet. The second topic we're going to explore is training to failure versus training to a 1 to 2 reps RIR, and then kind of even talking a little bit further into like maybe 3 reps RIR or even 4. The third and final topic is going to be on rest periods, shorter rest periods versus longer rest periods and implications for each. But before we dive into these topics, Brian, why don't you tell me about how your last week has been?
Oh yeah, man. Week has been interesting. I mentioned on the last podcast that we were heading up into the mountains for a family getaway, and we ended up coming home a day early. So the story basically is that the Airbnb that we booked, we thought was a 2-bedroom. It turned out that the second bedroom was actually like literally in the entrance to our unit. So we had our baby sleeping at our feet in a pack and play, and then we had our toddler literally right outside our door with nothing keeping him constrained. He managed to figure out how to climb down from the top bunk even though we took the ladder away. So he kind of like hurled over the side and, rappelled down. So it was a disaster. We didn't sleep much and ended up driving home in a snowstorm the next night. So tubing was cool. Had a little bit of a hiatus in my training. Had 2 days off, which was nice. I think I discussed how I split my full body program up into upper, lower as I was preparing for this trip. So I did hit, I think, 4 or 5 days in a row leading to the trip. So 2 days recovery felt great. Somehow I got back from the trip and realized that I had like a minor strain in somewhere in my lower glute or upper hamstring. I looked at a diagram and I think it's my quadratus femoris, which is sort of like the lower part of the glute. But oddly enough, I can do all the leg curl variations just fine, but I can't really reach full extension in a hip extension movement. So just today I did hamstrings with a hip extension for the first time in I think 8 or 9 days. And I couldn't do my deficit stiff-legged deadlift that I'd been doing and ended up subbing in an RDL because the range of motion was a little bit shorter and I didn't have to get that sort of deep stretch that takes place. And I was able to get through that, so hopefully it heals up over this next week and then I can either go back to the deficit stiff-legged deadlift, or I guess it's possible that the deficit is why I pulled it. So I'm just going to kind of feel it out, and if I need to kind of audible this movement to an RDL for the rest of the mesocycle and going forward, then I'll do that too. But quad game has been great. One thing I just instituted this week was adding in one superset at the end of each of my base quad movements. So I have the hack leg press machine, and I'll do my 3 or 4 working sets, and then right after the final set I go into like a heels elevated goblet squat, which is just awful. And then today I went from my last set of leg extensions directly into a heels elevated air squat. And I just tried to make that hurt as much as possible and only got 10 reps on an air squat. So it's one of those things where when an air squat gets that challenging, I think you know that you created a good stimulus. And leg training's been going well. Everything's good. Enjoying the structure still. And yeah, dude, I hear you're going to be moving out of Mexico. Give us the background. What's going on in your world?
Yeah, so we will be leaving here first week of March, so in about 3 weeks, I suppose, 4 weeks. And we have a wedding in South Carolina which was the real reason, we were heading back. And then it's really hot here and it's winter, so it's only going to get hotter because we were kind of playing like, okay, maybe we'll come back because we're in Playa del Carmen. And we decided like it's really hot and traveling right now it's just really difficult because things change with COVID and stuff so much. And we're like, let's just, pop up somewhere in the States that we've never been before, and which will be a venture in its own right. So We're not 100% sold, so I don't want to say something and then we change our minds when it comes out, but we're between Salt Lake City, Boise, Idaho, or Austin, Texas is what we're landing on. And then we'll plan on spending 2 to 3 to like 5 months there and maybe move on to somewhere else or something like that and just kind of play the waiting game. So that's the latest with that. I have about a week back in the gym now, 4 days, I guess, because it's Thursday now. So that's been good. My weight is finally like slowly inching back up. After that week off from the gym, I dropped 4 full pounds, which I mean is largely like water, some sodium, muscle glycogen, but still is then I can feel it as I get back into the training sessions where it's like it takes days of that higher carbohydrate intake for like my pump to fill out for my being able to perform, match my reps from the previous week. So it's just climbing that ladder to get back up. So I had a really solid upper body session yesterday, which like let me know that, okay, like I'm, compensated water, glycogen, compensated again. But a little wrinkle in my training that we discovered last week. So we've been talking about how I have a three leg day week, and the third leg day has just been like bodying me. So I'll get like super like dizzy and I have to like hold on, and I mean I'm sweating like really really badly, and it's all supersets. So it's like it starts with supersets on the leg extension and the lying leg curl for sets of 20, 4 of them. So it's like pretty gnarly, and then I move into the hack squat after that, and the hack squat is like after each set I take like 4 or 5 minutes and I just sit there and I'm a mess. So I was like talking to my coach. I'm like, I think like something else might be going wrong. Like I'm having all these hypoglycemic symptoms, but I'm eating 100 grams plus of carbs. That morning before I go to the gym, I'm having a ton of carbs intra-workout via like Gatorade, and I'm like, it just seems that I don't understand that. I don't think I could be going hypo. What we basically concluded is like I am, because the day before that training day is a rest day, so my carbohydrates come down dramatically. And then just because my body is so carbohydrate adapted right now, I'm basically just like pissing through them. So what we're going to try and do is just try and get a second meal in before I go to the gym. So I'll have at least like 225 grams of carbs on that day before I get there, and then add more fat into those first meals to kind of slow that carbohydrate uptake. And hopefully tomorrow will be the first test of that. And hopefully I don't experience any of those awful hypo symptoms. But it was just kind of wild because I was like, man, these are these hypo symptoms, but I'm eating so much carbs, there's no way I could be going hypo. But I mean, we kind of think that I am. So
yeah,
next week I should have an update on that.
Cool. Yeah, I remember we were having a side conversation about that when you posted about it on your story. So that's really cool because one of your theories was the hypo, and it was cool that your coach kind of confirmed that belief that you were spot on, and that now you have a potential solution. So you'll have to keep everyone updated on how that goes.
Yeah.
Cool. One other thing I just wanted to say real quick before we get going was an episode that we officially haven't aired yet on our channel, but I think is coming next week. We had 2 guests on, Abel Shabai and Dave McConey. It was our first episode with guests. It was pretty cool. I also had the opportunity to be on Abel's podcast a couple days ago. I'm not sure when that one's going to air, but we talked a lot about the implications of staying lean and some of the practices that I utilized in the cut that I did from 205 to 185 and how it was like the easiest cut ever. So that'll be cool if you guys want to check that out on his channel. It's called Sustainable Self-Development. And then Aaron and I are both going to be on Dave McConey's channel, which is Brains and Gains podcast. And we'll be doing that next week. So y'all can look out for that one too.
So kind of how the planning works out, the show with Abel and Dave will be last week's show. This one will come out after that one. So just kind of strange because we're talking about it like in the past, but it's like this episode will be in the future of that one. So just so everyone will understand, the Abel and Dave show will be the one prior to this in the episode
Yeah,
list.
Exactly. We're about 2 weeks ahead, which is awesome. So moving on to kind of the topics of the day, I want to kick this first one over to you. Dieting, eating in general. A lot of people have preferences for a higher carbohydrate approach. Others have preferences for higher fat approach. But What does science say? What do we need to know about this to make a decision on what might be best for us?
Yeah, so the first thing I kind of want to talk about to consider is whether we are talking about a higher fat diet or a higher carbohydrate diet in terms of going into a calorie deficit or in terms of just like your general diet, right? Your lifestyle type diet. Let's say if you're just eating for maintenance or something like that. Um, and the real reason for that is, well, there's two different considerations. One is more short term, which would be a calorie deficit for a period of X weeks, a few months perhaps, more geared towards aesthetics and physique. The other is longer term, not for X period, just kind of how your lifestyle is, and that is more health and longevity focused. So I think it's important to kind of provide that caveat between the two because it's important for how the rest of the conversation is going to go. So the first thing is, does it matter in terms of a higher carbohydrate diet or a higher fat diet? I believe that it does. First, I will talk about that kind of just general lifestyle diet, and then we'll get into dieting specifically. So kind of what a lot of the research will point to is that a higher fat diet, or not necessarily a higher fat, but a lower carbohydrate diet for like long term, is a little bit more beneficial for your kind of health and longevity just because of the oxidative stress that can be placed on the body with a higher carbohydrate diet. And because of a lot of the nutrients and benefit you get from high quality fats. So meaning foods like your olive oil, your extra virgin olive oil, oil, avocados, nuts and seeds that are going to be high in omega-3s, omega-3 polyunsaturated fats, and then even some of like your quality saturated fats as well. So coconut oil or even the byproduct of some of your lean cuts of animal meat. So in terms of that, it will be generally a little bit better for what health and longevity on what the current research says. And you'll kind of see a shift of some of like your bodybuilders and things like that who are not like competitive anymore, and they're like, hey, I'm transitioning to a new phase of my life. They will generally bring their carbohydrate down a little bit, increase their fat, because it's going to be just a more realistic approach for long term. So that's kind of my point on overall general health. Now moving into what we really want to talk about, right? What is going to be the best for getting lean, looking shredded, being jacked, all of that. This is where my sentiment kind of flips to the other side. I'm going to almost always opt for a higher carbohydrate diet. And the real reason why is once you equate calories and adherence, which, I want to make, a point here, two massive considerations to make. These are the two real reasons that so many people are not, don't, reach their goals with it, is because they're not adherent and their calories aren't equated for. So that's the first thing. It's a massive statement to make there. It does matter. And the reasons why is like, where's your starting point, right? So if you're at a healthy body fat percentage already and your goal is to get lean, dieting on a higher carbohydrate intake is usually going to provide you a little bit more like flexibility and less impact in other areas of your life that I will get into in a little bit. The one time that I would say that I would prefer to go the other approach, the higher fat diet and the lower carbohydrate diet, is with an individual who is already maybe at a less healthy body fat percentage where they're a little bit, I don't want to use the word obese, but like overweight. Because generally what happens with that is your blood glucose, your fasting blood glucose is going to be elevated. And with that, feeding you higher carbohydrate is pretty much only going to exacerbate that, or maybe not even exacerbate, but make it harder for us to get that blood glucose into a better position. So with that, going with a lower carbohydrate and a higher fat approach is going to be generally what I would do with a client. Moving back into that person who's already, let's say you're 20% body fat and you want to get leaner, going with a higher carbohydrate approach is generally going to be better for you, and here is why. Training modality and intensity. So on a higher carbohydrate, you're going to be able to push your training harder because carbohydrate is basically our go fuel, right? Our bodies prefer to run on glucose, which is, the most basic form of what carbohydrate breaks down to. Our bodies can run on fat via conversions or ketogenesis, but given the opportunity, our body's going to take the glucose 10 out of 10 times. So providing yourself more carbohydrate in that is going to make your body not have to go through that conversion process. It's going to allow you to train harder and to facilitate the recovery process faster after training by modulating the elevated cortisol response by dumping in glucose, which will cause which cause your body to secrete insulin, which is then going to drive that that cortisol down and facilitate the recovery process sooner. So the more muscle you have is also going to play into that, because you can store that glycogen from the carbohydrate in your muscles. So the more you have, the higher carbohydrate you can diet on. And then propensity to hunger. And this is kind of what I wanted to talk about. So, one of the last things I wanted to talk about because of how important it is. So one of the biggest things with effective dieting is being able to manage hunger. And when it comes to carbohydrate versus fat, you can just eat so much more carbohydrate for equal caloric content as opposed to fat. So satiety isn't purely just calorie driven. It's largely driven by volume and density of the food too. And for that, you can just eat so much more volume of food as it comes to carbohydrate as opposed to fat. And the real reason for that is equating calories. A gram of carbohydrate is 1 gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories and 1 gram of fat is 9 calories. And that's how that helps you in that degree. So pushing things like vegetables, really high satiety carbohydrate like boiled potatoes, which are the highest on the satiety index, can really be a game changer in that. So for those reasons, generally speaking, for most people, going with a higher carbohydrate approach will be better. The last thing I wanted to talk about on that is people who really do have a preference, right? So I'm sure we've all experienced this, people who say man, I just feel a lot better with higher fats. And I'm not downplaying that, what those individuals are saying, but in my experience, especially with the clients that I've had and things like that, these individuals who do better on a diet of fewer carbs and more fats, it's generally because of underlying digestive issues that are then exacerbated when they eat a higher incident of carbohydrates. Because carbohydrates can ferment, right? They can ferment, sit in the small intestine. If you have maybe some intestinal permeability or digestive dysfunction, those carbohydrates will then kind of sit in that small intestine and ferment and cause, further digestive issues. They cause bloating. You might get, symptoms of SIBO, low stomach acid, or these other things that will just kind of manifest more from a higher carbohydrate diet. So is the problem the carbohydrates per se? Not really. The problem is you have digestive dysfunction that shows up with more carbohydrates as opposed to more fats. So I think that's, something just to really, question if it's the reason you're doing better with higher fats because you have underlying digestive issues. And most often that is generally the case in what I've found. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's all really good. I think I want to pinpoint one thing that you said toward the beginning, regarding kind of the context of whether you're on a diet, like you're dieting to lose weight, or whether you're massing or bulking or lean gaining or whatever, where you're gaining weight. And kind of maybe draw some attention to some more freedom that you may have when you're looking to increase calories and increase body weight. In that, because complex carbohydrates and high quality carbohydrates can be so filling and so satiating, and the things that you do on a diet, such as overeat on vegetables and really focus on those like complex potatoes and oatmeals and really filling foods like that, those are sort of the things that you can't do as much of when you're trying to gain weight, because you don't want to have all of that satiety. You don't want to be so full that the thought of food crushes your motivation to even eat. So I think that you have a bit more freedom with the palatability of the foods that you select when you have more calories to utilize. And if you find yourself, obviously the default is going to be to try to focus on the foods that are the highest quality, that are going to have the micronutrients as well. But there inevitably will reach a point, as you're experiencing in your mass as well, where food just isn't interesting anymore, and it's almost forced at times. So
Yeah.
I find that too, and that like anecdotally, like my history, right, going through IF and stuff like that has always been much more fat based. Like when I'm trying to fit 3,500 calories into 2 meals, which I had been doing for like 8 years during intermittent fasting, there's no way that I'm eating 200 plus carbohydrates at each meal, right? So instead, I'm opting for some of these higher fat foods in that situation of intermittent fasting. That isn't optimal. I'm not trying to say that it's optimal, right? But like you alluded to regarding kind of individual preference and the lifestyle considerations that go into these things too. So having, these more palatable foods could help you reach a caloric goal in that state, in that case. Alternatively, when you're dieting, I think it's even more important to prioritize the foods that are filling and are satiating, because you're just not going to have that many calories. We've all experienced that, where like in the beginning of a diet, everything is so easy, and the first few weeks we're rolling by and the scale is just dumping weight because glycogen and water and all these things, intracellular fluids, are just falling out of you, and it's very motivating, and you're like, oh, I could do this forever, no problem. And then you reach a point where it's not so easy anymore, and you really do have to make these sacrifices of like, okay, instead of this carbohydrate, I'm going to have 200 grams more of vegetables or something like that. So those same kind of things that you don't want to do when you're bulking are the things that you have to do when you're cutting. So I just wanted to kind of bring some light to that. And do you have any additional thoughts kind of as related to that?
No, I mean, everything you said is good, especially considering what you wrapped up with dieting. It's hit the nail on the head.
All good.
All right, moving on to the second topic. We are talking about training to failure versus training to a 1 RIR, a 2 RIR, or even pushing even higher to like maybe a 4 RIR. Man, I don't know why I'm having such a hard time saying that, which stands for reps in reserve, by the way. So, Brian, let's kick this off.
Yeah, totally. So reps in reserve is something that we've discussed a lot on this podcast. It's kind of the way that we train. I mean, we don't necessarily go to failure all the time. I don't think that either of us are opposed to going to failure sometimes. And I'll also say that both of us have trained to failure in the past. And this is one thing that, is probably the biggest critique of RIR in general, is that people just suck at it. So if you don't know what failure is, you're even going to have less luck trying to predict how far you are from failure, right? Where do I go with this? So Eric Helms, I mentioned this on another of our earlier podcasts, I believe. For his, I think it was his doctorate or his dissertation, he conducted a study where he took trained males and asked them what their 10 RM bench press was from, just training in the gym. What is their 10 rep max? And then he took them in the gym and put some weight on the bar, put bags over the weights so they couldn't see what it was, and we're just like, there's some nominal amount of weight on the bar that I know you can lift, take it to failure. And the average was 6 reps off. So somebody who said their 10 RM was 200 pounds was doing 16 reps with that. I think the highest outlier was 23 or 27 reps. So somebody did either 13 or 17 reps more than what they thought they could do. And these were in like...
That is like the ultimate sandbagger.
No,
right
for
there.
sure. He's like, oh, I'm in the gym. This is my 10 rep max. I'm sure of it, right? And then you go and do 23 of them. And then I think there were a couple people that, like 1 or 2, that didn't even match their 10 RM. And then there were a couple that, were within 1 or 2 reps or whatever, which is kind of what you'd expect. But the standard deviation being 6 reps is a really big number. I think the standard deviation is the right word, or maybe it was the median. Anyways, James Steele is another researcher, and he wanted to look into this a little bit further, and he took well-trained people and basically found that if you're really well-trained and you've been training with RIR in the past, you're pretty good at it, and you can predict your proximity to failure within 1 or 2 reps, which is pretty solid. I would actually argue that I'm 0 to 1 rep. Like I'm very, very confident on almost all my movements that when I say I have 1 to 2 reps left, that I legitimately have 1 to 2 reps left. I think that James Steele, what he had them do in this study, and I'm not sure if it was this study or if I'm confusing it with another one, but I think that he had them call out when they were 2 reps shy of failure and then had them just continue to failure and see if they could get the 2 reps that they predicted they did. And that's kind of how he came up with this data. So I think it's a pretty accurate assessment. Not that I would want to be distracted in the middle of my set and be like, okay, I'm at 2 RIR now. But like, that was what they had to do for research here. So kind of with that out of the way, and if we just assume that you have to know what failure is, like you have to at some point either have trained to failure and have a really good sense of where that point is to get the most out of RIR, then I think we can kind of move forward with the topic with that as kind of background information. So first off, the overall body of research has been pretty absolute that most studies are going to show that training anywhere from 1 to 3 RIR is going to give you the same benefit as training to failure. Cody Hahn and colleagues did a study that was titled, "Does Training to Failure Result in More Central Nervous System Fatigue?" And their conclusion was basically that the markers of peripheral fatigue and muscle damage appeared to be higher in response to training to failure. That makes sense, right? This was one of the studies that's kind of been used in the idea that as you get closer to failure, you increase fatigue exponentially, but you only increase potential hypertrophy or stimulus linearly. So your fatigue is increasing multiple fold every time you get closer to failure, from 3 to 2, from 2 to 1, from 1 to 0. But the stimulus that you're getting to the actual muscle is going up linearly, so it's not going up nearly as much as the fatigue is. So I think having that as kind of just some background knowledge throughout the rest of this discussion about RIR and training to failure is important as well. Before I move on, any thoughts, Aaron?
Yeah, I agree, especially with like the most recent thing you talked about with training to failure increases fatigue at a rate faster than your hypertrophy is going to increase. That makes perfect sense when you think about it. Another thing, kind of following up on what you said earlier, is the closer, and this is how I find it myself in my training. When I'm like, if you're like, okay, here's a weight, what is my RIR? And I'm like, I don't have a clue. Like, my estimation would be god awful. But in the middle of that set, I feel pretty good knowing like, okay, I think I have 2 reps left. I'm going to cut it here if my goal is the RIR. So I think you need a little bit more, proximity or realness of in the middle of that set, because you have feedback cues versus like how fast the weight is moving, how fatigued your, the local muscle feels in the middle of that movement, or like how many sets you've done or something like that, what you did on the last one. And I think that allows your accuracy for reps in reserve to go up like in the moment. And I think in that regard, it's pretty good. But like you said, you have had to have trained to failure to know what that feels like, especially because there's people who are more fast twitch or slow twitch where, maybe the movement slowed down 4 reps ago, but you're still moving. But then there's the person where like 1 rep slows down, next rep is failure. So I think that's where that individual variability comes into play for sure.
Yeah, and a lot of that is even muscle specific, like chest stuff. I know as soon as it begins slowing down, I'm like, shit, I have like 1 or 2 reps left. Like, I'm basically done at this point. Whereas for something like back, I feel like reps can slow down and I can just keep grinding for like 6 more. So individual muscle type plays a role there too. I love what you said about being able to feel that kind of in set. And I think that brings up another point, which is that 2 RIR is really, really fucking hard. And I don't know that people really realize that. Like, a lot of people don't even realize that training to failure is like what it actually feels like. So then they're like, oh, you leave reps in reserve, like you don't actually go to failure, and they think that that's really easy. I've had a number of people send me DMs when they're watching my videos, and I'm like dying on the last rep, like I'm spitting out of my mouth and like my face is disgusting, and I'm like 1 to 2 RIR, and they're like, huh? Like, to me that looked like you were past failure, and I'm like, I made the rep, how can I be past failure? So I think that a lot of that is perception, and when people realize that, when we're talking about failure, we're talking about like literally, to say it this way, someone has a gun to your head and you either get another rep or you die. Like, is that your failure point? So when you think of it like that, like 2 IR is like 2 reps from like, I'm going to die. Anyways, moving on here. So James Krieger has a research review called Weightology, and that's where I get kind of a lot of these studies and references that I use. So over the next couple studies that I reference are all coming from his Weightology research review. It's really cool. It's $10 a month, and it takes all the studies that are relevant. You can search them, and you can basically read reviews that are written in more layman terms than reading actual research. So in case anyone's interested in that. So what he basically found through the work that he's done in meta-analysis is, like I mentioned earlier, that 1 to 3 RIR is more or less the same results as training to failure with the exponential increase in fatigue. One of the reasons that this seems to make sense is that you can actually do more volume of work when you're not training to failure. So say you have 3 sets of, we'll call it a squat. And for easy numbers, we're going to use 100 pounds. And one person goes 100 pounds to failure. So say they get 14 reps. But they're so fatigued from that 14 rep set that their next set, they come back and they get 11. And then the next set, they're even more fatigued and they get 8. So this person did 100 pounds times 14, 11, and 8, which is a total number of reps of 33 reps. The person that did not go to failure, that left 2 reps in reserve, they couldn't get 14 because they didn't go to failure, so they got 12. But then on the next set, they got 11, and the next set, they got 10. They got the same amount of reps, 33 reps, as the other people, but they didn't take a single set to failure. So now they have more energy that they can either apply to additional sets of that movement, or they can now move on to a leg extension or to a hack squat or a leg press or whatever else. Whereas that person that did 3 sets of squats to failure, they basically completely exhausted themselves, created this exponential increase in fatigue just to get the same amount of volume as this other person that still had a quality session, but has significantly less fatigue, and they can now go create volume elsewhere or do more sets of that same movement. So that is super interesting. Have you seen that as well, Aaron, in any of your experience?
Yeah, so anecdotally, that is something that I think what I want to talk about in there is I'm curious how much of that has to do with like localized muscle fatigue and like performance of the muscle, or what kind of builds in terms of like, central fatigue from just really overexerting yourself, or I don't want to say overexerting yourself, really just pushing yourself to your limits. And what it immediately made me think of is back in like, I don't know, 2013, I think it was 2012 and 2013, when we would do those 20 rep back squat sessions at the old gym on whatever Tuesdays, I think it was, maybe Mondays. That was the only thing we did. Maybe sometimes we would do like dumbbell pullovers afterwards, but I mean, it would ruin me, and I think if I did that same, instead of doing, one set of 20 reps at like 295 pounds, if I did, 5 sets of 4 with like 3 minutes in between or whatever, I could go on and do more. But I mean, those reps like 16 through 20 are soul sucking, and it takes everything you have and you're completely ruined afterwards. But to play kind of devil's advocate is, there's the argument from some other people in the industry that will say things around like metabolite training and things that are less, I don't want to say less measurable, but there's not as much like research and money behind because they're harder to get people to do well, and they're the danger is there too, pushing people to their absolute limits. But it's definitely interesting because it's at what threshold or point does effort and pushing yourself when to the max become either a detriment or a benefiting factor.
Interesting. Yeah, the 20 rep squat is an interesting example because where I stand now in kind of the way that I look at training, the 20 rep squat program is really not that smart. And a couple reasons why I would say that is because putting a bar on your back and forcing yourself to throw weight on the bar and get 20 reps every week creates a lot of compromised positions and a lot of contribution from muscles that you're not intending to use. And then the other thing I'll say to that, and this is part of kind of what gave us that feeling of like accomplishment and like pushing through pain, but there was no standardization of rest between reps or anything like that. The whole goal was no matter what, I'm going to get 20 reps, but it didn't matter whether like in week 1 you did that with 20 reps at 2:0 tempo where you're just kind of rolling through it and it's good quality reps, and then in week 12 you have 100 more pounds on the bar and now you're resting 10 seconds between reps, and then between reps 15 and 20 you're resting 20 seconds between reps, and you're literally just standing there with a bar on your back creating all this axial fatigue. And like, no wonder we couldn't do anything else the rest of the day after doing that, because your whole body is just like, what the fuck just happened to me? So I think that like the whole discussion of teaching you to work hard, like these were all little pennies deposited into that bucket of gains over the course of our life, where we learned how to work hard and we learned how to push through misery and like all these things that now kind of help us see the light. But looking back at it, it's kind of like, I wonder if we could have done that a little bit more intelligently.
Yeah, I think I used a bad example as the back squat. It was just the first thing that kind of came into mind, because the danger is much more present as opposed to like, I don't know, maybe something like a hack squat, right, where you're not going to like compromise your lower back or something like that to nearly a degree.
For sure.
So yeah, bad
No,
example.
all good. I think it actually was a really good teaching point overall, so I'm glad you brought that up. Cool. So I have another study to talk about here, and this one's really cool. The link was actually broken, so I wasn't able to reference it completely, but what they did is they took one person and they had one leg perform leg extensions to failure, and for 3 sets to failure. And then with the other leg, they matched the same volume that the other leg did to failure. And if it took more sets to do, which of course it did because they weren't going to failure, then that's what it did. So they did maybe an extra set on the other leg to make up for the volume that the failure leg achieved. And then at the end of this experiment, they tested the legs of the same person, so there's no genetic inequalities or no nutritional variables or anything along those lines. It was the same person, and they found more increased growth in the leg that was not training to failure. So I think that is a pretty cool study and a testament to that process too. And then I have one other, maybe two other studies to discuss here. One being that it seems that training to failure is more important in higher rep sets than it is in lower rep sets. This was a study in, where was this from? Muscle activation strategies during strength. I don't have the author in front of me at the moment, but they basically found that maximum muscle activation occurs at 3 reps shy of failure. So that would be like full motor unit recruitment. And therefore the practical takeaway is that stopping 1 to 3 reps shy of failure potentially would be best. When you do higher rep sets, you have to get a little bit closer to failure because the weight isn't as heavy. So just another kind of caveat to keep in mind, that if you're going to do a higher rep set, which kind of just hurts more in general, like you literally have to go like 14 reps out of 15 to get the benefit that you might get doing 4 reps when you could do 7 or something like that. And then kind of another idea along the same lines that transitions well is this study by Karsten and colleagues called The Impact of 2 High Volume Set Configuration Workouts on Resistance Training Outcomes in Recreational Trained Men. Long title. Essentially what they did is they had one group train 4 sets of 10 to failure. They started the first set at their 10 RM weight, and then I guess they knocked weight off so that they could continue to get 10 reps every set and hit failure. The other group used the exact same weight, which was their 10 rep max, but they did 8 sets of 5. So instead of 4 sets of 10, they did 8 sets of 5. That means that it was volume equated, right? So they did the same amount of reps at the same amount of weight. What they found, not so surprisingly, was that the group that did 8 sets of 5 increased more strength, and the group that did 4 sets of 10 increased a little bit more muscle mass. It wasn't a whole ton. I think this makes a ton of sense for two reasons. One is that the 8 sets of 5 are more specific to strength because it's lower rep. But the one thing that you need to keep in mind in that assessment is that those sets were all 5 RIR because they're using a 10 rep max weight. So they're doing 8 sets of 5 at a 10 RM weight. They're leaving 5 RIR in every set. So that makes sense again as to why we might not see as much muscle growth in that group, because we kind of predetermined in the discussion, right, that you want to stay about 1 to 3 reps shy of failure if you're looking for hypertrophy. But this also plays into other data that's out there that when you're training to strength, you really don't want to hit failure. You don't even really want to get close to failure, because anytime you get close to failure, you start decreasing the learning aspect, the neural learning, right? Your body starts trying to figure out ways to compensate. Like if you're 2 reps shy of failure in a bench press, it might look perfect to the outside, but I'm pretty sure you hook an EMG up to you and there's different muscle activation patterns happening at 2 reps shy of failure than you are at 5 reps shy of failure. So strength is a skill that needs to be refined. And when you get close to failure, you mess that whole process up and the neural learning doesn't take place as effectively. So that's just kind of something cool to keep in mind, I think. Like we're running a strength cycle in one of my programs right now, and I see a lot of reps from people that are grinders. Like people are really, hitting that 3 RM with 1 RIR, and it almost makes more sense in that case to see them leaving 3-ish reps in reserve, but just making every rep snappy and explosive and perfect, so there actually isn't any internal compensation that might be taking place. That's really all I have on failure training. Aaron, any additional thoughts?
I do have some additional thoughts, actually. One thing I think, kind of a little bit of an aside or a note, and then a question about it. So, one thing I think it's important especially when taking considerations from studies, is like, what is the population of this study? And this actually stems from a conversation I had with someone who is a PhD student, and I asked him about, because he runs like labs and tests, or not tests, but studies, and helps them. And I was like, well, what is what is the quality of the people when they say like resistance trained? And he just kind of like gave me that like side eye, and it was like, it's like your high school bros that lift and that want like a DEXA scan, so they show up for it and they get like credits. So I think in general, when we have like multiple studies that are all pointing to the same thing, kind of like how a meta-analysis or something would be great, right? We have really probably very confident for that information. But one thing I think can be potentially misleading is when you take like one study and run with it, right? Which I'm sure we see that most people don't do that, but there's a ton of people that will like cherry pick kind of studies to prove their point, right? Of course. So that's kind of what I want to lead to, is just being a little bit careful with that. If like something comes out and it's like, hey, you shouldn't train to anything less than like 5 RIR, and then you start just taking it for gospel, like you're just leaving probably a ton of progress on the table. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I think, the statement of being trained, I believe in the literature that only requires 6 months of 3 times a week training to be trained.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I have heard recently amongst the community that when certain scientists that I follow are conducting studies and include trained people, they're looking for people that can at least bench press body weight for a single and squat body weight and a half for a single. And those aren't like really impressive numbers, but I mean, I think that's a little bit more impressive than just somebody that trains 3 times a week for 6 months.
Definitely. Okay, last thing on this part. And this is just me kind of playing devil's advocate for conversation. Why do we think, with this information that we just have here, the best physiques in the world, right, the most jacked people in the world, which is generally going to be your professional bodybuilders and such, have such intense training sessions with multiple drop sets to failure, rest pause sets, metabolic stuff? Why do we think they train in this manner when so much of the research we have suggests that much of it might be very superfluous?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my very first thought, and probably my most prominent thought in response to that is just the number of substances that they're taking. I think that, one thing that we kind of know from people that are enhanced is that they lift a lot more weight than people that aren't enhanced, and they can do a lot more damage to their body. So almost all of them train on a bro split, basically training each muscle group once a week, with the rationalization that they do so much damage that they're unable to recover from it, and therefore have to train once a week. So they are trying to basically take it to the house every time they do it, because they know they're not coming back for another 7 days to do it again. With that said, there has been a bit of a transition in the enhanced space in the last few years, of more of these practitioners taking a bit more of an evidence-based approach. You can look to John Jewett as somebody that's doing that. He was, I believe, 5th at the Olympia 2 years ago, and didn't peak as well this year, so I think he was pretty disappointed in his result. But he's a savage. And then Matt Janssen is an IFBB pro and a coach to a number of top IFBB bodybuilders, and he follows RIR and full range of motion and doesn't do drop sets and supersets and all these crazy metabolite techniques. And he just took Sean Clarita to win the Olympia this year, in the 212 class. And kind of even looking further beyond that, you look at Chris Bumstead, who won Classic Physique at the Olympia for the last 2 years. And he just made a post that he never uses more than 40 pounds for his bicep curls. And you look at that dude, and his arms are like fucking massive, and I'm curling the 50s, and I'm like, man, why am I curling the 50s? This dude's using 40s. So I think that, full range of motion and feeling the stretch and, really focusing on your movement and all these things, these are things that are beginning to take hold even in the enhanced community, and it's something that I think we're going to see more of over the decades going forward.
I agree. Yeah, I wanted to bring that up and see what your thoughts were on that, but yeah, I think I agree. The big thing I wanted to kind of follow up with really quick was part of the thing with your PEDs that changed the game is the amount of obviously testosterone and what that does to your recovery capacity. So that allows you to recover from these like super crazy intense sessions that us mere mortals would pale trying to recover from. So
I think I would even argue that these guys that are doing this and are at the top of their game and having the best success, this little guy who weighs under 200 pounds and doesn't take any substances, I think, for whatever it's worth, that if they took the same amount of volume they're doing, and instead of doing 25 sets of chest on Monday, they did 12 on Monday and 13 on Thursday, I still think they'd be better off, but no one's going to listen to me, so it's cool.
All right. I think we covered that one really, really well. Let's move on to the final topic we have, and this is around rest periods. So moving with a shorter rest period versus a longer rest period, implications of either on volume, rep execution, performance, etc. So why don't you tell me your thoughts here?
Yeah, this is one that we've kind of alluded to in prior podcasts too. I believe it was the Q&A session from either 1 or 2 episodes ago where we talked about resting between legs in a split squat versus resting between arms in like a lateral raise or a bicep curl or something like that. And we noted that the main reason that you have to rest so much longer between legs in a split squat than you do during arms is strictly a factor of recovery, right? That we need to make sure that our system, as well as the peripheral muscles themselves, have recovered from the bout. And a split squat uses your entire body, while your arms just use like a quarter of your body at most, maybe. So I think having that context in mind and understanding that recovery is important is a good background for this discussion. And then kind of going into that, there's a lot of like, even I guess is a perfect transition is what you asked about the drop sets and supersets and all the different intensity techniques, because essentially what those are a way for you to rest less and potentially get more volume in for the amount of time. So moving directly into that topic, I have one study Where is that on here? Basically, what the study did was they compared 3 straight sets of an exercise with 2 to 3 minutes rest in between sets. And then the other group did drop sets, one main set plus a whole bunch of drop sets until they equated the same volume as the group that did 3 straight sets. And so what it turned out was that they basically needed to do 4 or 5 drop sets to equate to the 3 straight sets volume. So now you're having to do like 2 or 3 extra sets just to get to that volume. So in this one study, that seemed to be an acceptable solution. They were able to match hypertrophy by doing these extra sets. But the important thing to keep in mind there is that you're not really saving that much time, because if you do 3 sets with 2 minutes rest in between, then you're looking at like 7 or 8 minutes, including the work time. And when you do one main set with like 4 or 5 drop sets afterward, it's not like you're dropping immediately. Like you're going to rest 15, 20 seconds or something like that, especially if you're doing 4 or 5 drop sets. Like you're not just dropping. And then you also have to remember that every time that you drop, you're accruing less volume. Like if you're starting with 50-pound dumbbells and by the end you're doing 15-pound dumbbells, then the amount of volume that you're getting with those 15-pound dumbbells is pennies compared to what you're able to achieve with the 50s. So the more drops you do, the worse your return gets. And part of the explanation for that is lactate accumulation and the high aerobic demand associated with those. So you're creating these levels of fatigue in your body that don't have to be there. So it's kind of like the similar discussion of training to failure versus not training to failure, right? You do these 3 straight sets to 2 RIR or whatever it is, and you get these incredible benefits. Or you can do 5 sets where you reduce weight every set and barely rest at all and take shit to the house and basically feel like complete ass afterwards to get the exact same result that you could get by doing 3 sets and actually resting. So that's my first study on that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. One thing I think that is really not to like argue against it, but what is these studies are looking for what is like going to be the absolute best approach, right, for the goal of like hypertrophy or equating it. In terms of taking that and applying it to your own self and your training, something that I think is important to consider is like, what are you going to enjoy more? So I find myself a little bit more towards having like not super short rest periods, but around like 2 to 2.5 minutes, because I like to have that feeling of like working and being sweaty. If I'm taking like 5, 6, 7 minutes between it, I feel like I'm just kind of sitting around playing on my phone, and I would say I wouldn't enjoy the workout quite as much. So I think potential to each person, you have to find that kind of balance of what is going to be the kind of best of both worlds for yourself.
That's interesting you say, 2.5 minutes, because as I go through these studies and I was kind of digging into the research in preparation for the show, it seemed to be that basically the end result of all of the studies was that 1 minute is way too short. Like you're not even doing yourself justice at a minute. And that the sweet spot seemed to be between like 2 and 4 minutes. So they kind of found that, like, I think there was even one study that I didn't include in this analysis that I saw because it wasn't super relevant, but it basically said that you have 2-minute rests and 4-minute rests, and there was no difference. But if you have a 2-minute rest and a 1-minute rest, there's a huge difference, or a 4-minute rest and a 1-minute rest, huge difference, right? But between 2 and 4, there wasn't that much of a difference. So I just remember kind of reading that as I was doing some initial research here. Okay, so the next study was about MPS response to training with different rest periods. So this is kind of interesting. I think it has a little bit of relevance for anabolic signaling, but I don't know that we can put a whole ton into MPS studies, but it is like, it's a piece of the pie, right? So MPS being muscle protein synthesis, which is the process that happens after you train that allows your body to build muscle. So the study was titled Short Interset Rest Blunts Resistance Exercise Induced Increases in Myofibrillar Protein Synthesis and Intracellular Signaling in Young Males. Love these titles. Such clickbait. So in this one, they compared a 1 minute rest versus a 5 minute rest. And they did 4 sets of leg press and 4 sets of leg extensions, both to failure. So at 0 to 4 hours, the MPS response was the same in both groups. But from 24 to 28 hours post workout, the longer rest group had 4.2 times the anabolic signaling compared to the 1 minute rest group. What do you think about that?
That's really interesting. And my initial thought to that is because especially like, okay, here we have legs, right? Especially the leg press and leg extension with that 1 minute set or 1 minute rest, like your output is going to severely decline, like set after set, especially because they're to failure. Like leg extensions are one of those things, like you do a fresh set of leg extensions to failure. Like let's say you get like, 21 reps. The next set you might drop to like 13. Yeah. That's very realistic. So yeah, this, to me from just like an anecdotal standpoint, seems perfectly like it would make sense.
Yeah, I think the other consideration here too is that you must assume that total volume has to be significantly lower in the group that only took 1 minute of rest if they're both doing 4 sets of leg press and 4 sets of leg extensions. And then I think that subjectively you would also finish each of these workouts. Like one workout you're going to finish in 15 or 20 minutes, and the other workout's going to take over an hour easily if you're resting 5 minutes between sets. So I think that your subjective level of fatigue upon finishing the workout is way different, right? The person that does those 8 sets to failure in 15 or 20 minutes is going to want to die. They're literally going to be on the ground writhing in pain. And then the person that did 8 sets over the course of, I guess with 5 minute rests, 50 to 60 minutes. That's long rest though, 5 minutes rest. That person's going to walk out of the gym feeling like I feel. Like I probably rest 5 minutes between most of my sets too. And I just kind of like hobble up the stairs and I'm like, fuck, my legs really hurt, but I'm not sweating and I don't feel like ass. And, I just finished my workout 5 minutes ago and started this podcast. So hopefully I don't, feel like I would feel after doing 8 sets to failure in 20 minutes, because I would not be doing this podcast right now. Okay, let's move on a little bit. So Schoenfeld did a study called Longer Interset Rest Periods Enhance Muscle Strength and Hypertrophy in Resistance-Trained Men. And they did 3 times a week full body sessions comparing 1 minute of rest versus 3 minutes of rest. The longer rest group had a significantly larger level of muscle fiber growth in all muscle groups tested or observed. So I think this isn't anything that we hadn't already kind of discussed earlier in the discussion. 1 minute rest is bad, 3 minute rest is good, but 2 is also pretty good, as we kind of discussed. Another study by Fink and colleagues called Effect of Rest Intervals and Training Loads on Metabolic Stress and Muscle Hypertrophy. And they found no change when comparing 8 rep sets with 3 minute rest to 20 rep sets with 1 minute rest. The difference in this study, that I think the cool context is that this study was on isolation movements. So as we'll see in another study that I referenced down below, isolation movements tend to do okay with lower rest. And I think that this makes 100% sense. Again, like this kind of even goes into what we were talking about in resting between legs on a split squat versus resting between arms in single arm movements, right? So isolation movements, you can do 8 rep sets with a 3 minute rest and it's heavy and whatever, and you get a good response, or you can just get through them quickly like circuit style or whatever you want to do and just do 20 rep sets with a 1 minute rest, and your arms and your lateral delts should be just fine. Right, Aaron?
Yeah, I feel the same way, and that's kind of how I will structure, my training a little bit, or training that I write is for your like larger body parts and movements. You need that rest, but I might, if we have like a big day, I might throw in like an arm circuit at the end where, hey, we're doing like 2 sets, bis and tris, back to back, and you can, you're going to have a similar output there, because there's just less, total system fatigue or central fatigue because of the muscle you're training, because they're isolations.
Yep. Cool. Well, I thought that I had a study to reference about compound movements down here, but I don't seem to see it. So I think it was it was actually with the study from the from the training to failure group was with compound movements, and there was a rest component to that too. But just kind of to summarize the rest piece, the idea is basically that if you're going to do compound movements, which are highly fatiguing, that your best benefit in there is to take enough rest that you've actually recovered and that you don't have systematic fatigue affecting you, and that you can execute quality sets with a good mind-muscle connection. And because isolation movements are less fatiguing, that if you want to do shorter rest periods and do higher reps and feel more of a burn and a pump, that doesn't seem to have as much of a negative ramification as you would expect to see in the compound movements. And that's really all I got.
Agreed. I will give a quick wrap up of the first two topics. So in terms of dieting, generally speaking, most are going to find it more advantageous to go with a higher carbohydrate approach. In terms of overall health and longevity, let's say if you're into your maybe 50s, 60s, 70s, going with a higher fat approach is generally going to be a little bit safer in terms of oxidative stress placed on the body. And then from the second topic being reps in reserve, it's hard to accurately estimate reps in reserve once you've trained via this cycle or this methodology for a few training cycles and know what that zero RIR feels like for a particular movement. It will help you estimate more appropriately moving on. Generally aiming for that 3 reps in reserve will maximize kind of the amount of the muscle fibers that are firing to kind of give you that greater or the kind of hit that threshold for hypertrophic response. But training to failure all the time is probably not going to be as advantageous as a 1 to 2 RIR because your fatigue will outpace the rate at which you can make hypertrophy. And then I think you did a pretty good job of just summarizing the third topic. So is there anything else, Bryan, you want to add to wrap this one up?
So real quick, just to remind everyone that if you're training for strength, that being a little bit further from failure is a smart idea. You don't want to have those compensations take place when you do get closer to failure, which are kind of just part of what's necessary to have happen as we approach failure. And hypertrophy, like we want to keep as much of that tension on the muscles as we can. But I think that that's even another explanation for why maybe 2 to 3 RIR is great for hypertrophy and maybe not going to failure. And that as we get to failure, there are compensations that take place even in hypertrophy. And we see that with the butt kicking back in the squats, or with pressing and kind of leaning to one side, or squirming with your torso, or whatever it is. So if RIR is scary for you, then I think that a practical approach to using RIR would be that you try your best to match an RIR in the first few sets, and then maybe on the last set of a movement you take it to the house and see how close you were with your assessments, and then you get a way to kind of feel it out, and you don't affect or negatively impact your ability to accumulate volume in those earlier sets, right? Because we use that reference of if you go to failure on your first set, then you see all this rep decline and you actually accumulate less volume overall. So maybe if you don't go to failure on those first early sets, you use it as an opportunity to practice RIR, and then on the last set, take it to the house, see how it goes, and then next week you can make adjustments based on kind of what information you receive from that.
Cool. Love it. Anything else,
That's all
Bryan?
I got, man.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening to this episode. I think it was pretty helpful. We got into some really deep parts of the topic that I think are things that like both of us didn't know or even on the radar for until we were pretty deep into our training careers. So if you're newer, this stuff can really help you out and change the trajectory of how your training and nutrition goes. So thanks for tuning in. Talk to you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening to Eat, Train, Prosper. If you found this episode valuable, please subscribe or share us with your friends. You can find more from Aaron at strakernutritionco.com and more from Bryan at evolvedtrainingsystems.com. Talk to you guys next time.